Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on project-based learning, or PBL. Again, I'm Amanda Uten and I teach at Chaminade Julienne Catholic High School. Before we get started, I just have a tiny disclaimer to share with you. I am not an expert in project-based learning. I have very limited experience with it, but I am very excited about it. So I really hope that together this week we can learn together and share our ideas. So most of this presentation, really all of it, are from these three sources. So please feel free to check out these sources, and I've posted all of them on the MEC website as well. So first, what is PBL? Well, it's an instructional approach, but it's really built on authentic, real-world learning activities that are designed to really engage student interest and to motivate them to want to do that certain project. So the whole learning approach is designed to answer a question you pose to your students or to solve a real-world problem, and it reflects what real adults are doing in the real world. So this really applies to 21st century education, which is the theme for this week. It teaches both 21st century skills, but it also teaches content, which is one of my sort of apprehensions about PBL. Was I was worried about where the content would fit into it. And as we're going to see, the content is certainly embedded into PBL. And so these are some of the skills that your students learn as they do their project: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, leadership, all of these 21st century skills that we want our students to have upon leaving our classroom. So some hallmarks of PBL. Obviously, content should be key. Working with standards, using the skills, inquiry, creation, getting your students to really work at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. Also a really important component is student voice and choice. So they feel like they have some ownership of the project. The project is organized around a driving question, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And really, really important at the end, you need to leave time for your students to revise their product and to reflect on their product. And finally, to really motivate your students at the beginning, you need to tell them that their presentation or their product is going to be shown to a public audience. Maybe you plan an exhibit, or you get other teachers or other classes to come and see what your students have designed or made from their project. So, content and skills are hallmarks of PBL. How does this fit with the flipped classroom? Well, I think it's a perfect fit. I think the videos can provide that content support if you need it. Just like the flipped classroom, PBL focuses on small groups of students working towards a common goal, and it allows students voice and choice. They're making decisions. Both the flipped class and PBL are really centered around my motto, which is putting the learning back into the students' hands, making them motivated to do the learning. So here's a nice graphic showing, again, sort of what we talked about with the flipped class. The old school teacher as taskmaster, rows on rows, repetitive homework tasks and tests, versus the new school, which is this is the 21st century school. Teacher as a guide on the side, the facilitator. There's collaboration, there's communication, students working in small groups. They're working on authentic tasks. So this is where I think education should be moving in the near future. So how do you create a project? Well, based on all of these sources that I have found, there are some 5 guiding principles to designing a project-based approach. So we're just going to go through each of these, starting with, begin with the end in mind. So starting a project really requires some experience on your part with what the content is and what you want your students to know. So you have to have some vision, you have to have obviously structure. You have to understand how your students learn, and really the part that's a little bit intimidating to me is all the upfront planning, because you have to know ahead of time, okay, what are the outcomes? How am I going to assess my students? What are the learning activities I'm going to do? So keep that in mind and use some resources to help you with that upfront planning. So as you start to plan your project, and hopefully on Wednesday night you and a small group of other teachers are going to start to plan a project, take these helpful hints with you. Work backward from a topic. So think about what you want your students to know, what you want them to make, and then work backwards. Use your standards because content is so important. Use all the resources that I've posted on the MEC website. There are libraries of projects already out there. Use your community resources. Go on field trips, on site visits, bring in guest speakers. There are people out there who would love to share their knowledge with you. And then also focus on community service. I know at my school that is a big thing. So if you can incorporate service into your project, the more the better. Okay, step number 2 is to craft this driving question. Driving questions are the true catalyst to get your students engaged. It helps get the inquiry process started. They should be intriguing, they should be complex, they should be problematic. The driving question should really make your students think about this topic. It shouldn't be a simple question. It should be a question that requires multiple activities and a synthesis of different types of information before it can be answered. It should also address authentic concerns. It should be real world for them. And as you go through your whole project, whether it's 2 weeks long or 2 months long, this driving question should serve as this sort of lighthouse to promote interest and to direct the students towards a goal. So driving questions are provocative. They're open-ended. They go to the heart of that discipline or topic. They should challenge your students. They should maybe even arise from real-world dilemmas or maybe a news story that's cropped up in your community or your state. And obviously, they should be consistent with standards. So go ahead and pause your video. I put 5 driving questions up here, and I want you to identify, is it a good driving question or is it not a good driving question? So pause your video and do that. All right, so here are the answers. So the first 4 are not good driving questions, and the explanations are there for you. And the 5th one is actually yes. This encourages examination and interpretation of a complex issue. So that's step number 2. So step number 3, planning the assessment. How are you going to figure out what and how your students learned? So consider these 3 questions. How well do the students know the content? How well have they mastered the skills? Remember, those are the 2 key components of PBL. And finally, how well did they apply those skills and knowledge to make their culminating product? Now, there are multiple ways to do assessments, and I'm going to share 3 different types of assessment you can use with PBL. So content you can assess with presentations. You can still use tests and quizzes here. Skills, I think performance rubrics are probably the best because they're showing a skill to you. And then progress over time is a good way to show whether or not they're applying their skills and knowledge. So the first example of assessment is that culminating product, what they're working towards for that whole timeline of their project. So this could be a proposal or a design solution. They could be even inventing a device, a multimedia project. So this is sort of the big culminating product. However, along the way, they have to create some multiple products in order to get there that are going to build their skills and build their content. So essays, outlines, drafts, these sort of things. And finally, this is my favorite, artifacts. These are pieces of evidence that show the learning process. And all of this could be kept in some sort of portfolio. So these are notes student takes, journal entries upon reflecting upon their project. Maybe they did an interview, so maybe it's a transcript or questions they want to ask the person they're interviewing. So these are pieces of evidence. Okay, so that's assessment. Finally, number 4, we have map the project. So this is sort of creating your timeline. You're identifying content and skills. You're gathering the resources from online, from other teachers, from your community especially. You're starting to plan out the learning activities. And the great thing for me with this one is I can use learning activities that I've already done in the past, but I just sort of go about them a different way, or I incorporate them into this project. I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to try to use a lot of what I already have. And this is probably the most challenging step, really mapping out day by day and week by week what you want your students to do and what you want your students to know. Along with mapping out the project, you should consider these questions. How are you going to scaffold the learning for your students? I don't suggest just throwing out a driving question and say, go for it. I mean, you're going to have to scaffold with maybe some direct instruction, the videos for the flipped classroom, some handouts, maybe some worksheets or some web quests. How do I plan for knowledge and skills? It doesn't just come magically. They have to practice them. They have to learn essential content. So if they're writing a research paper, for instance, well, they have to learn how to do research using databases. They have to learn documentation and citation and all of those things. What are some activities I might use, and how can I break down these long-term activities into manageable tasks? Students need goals, right? Especially short-term goals. So how can you go about doing that? And there's a wonderful project planning form that I've shared with you on the website and that I will probably have available on Wednesday as we start to plan our own projects. And the last step is just overall, this sort of is going on in the background the whole time, is just managing the process. So I would highly recommend at the very start with the driving question, you give your students the goals for the project and remind them of these goals as they continue. Group students appropriately. And I'm not going to suggest how to do that. Only you know your students and how you should group them for that project. Organize activities, deadlines, scope. They're going to have questions along the way. You have to clarify those questions, monitor and regulate student behavior. Again, I don't suggest just throwing out a driving question and say, answer the question. So you have to sort of manage the process all along. And finally, do not forget that the students need to, as they go and at the end, reflect upon their experience. What have they learned? How have they learned it? What are they going to take with them moving forward beyond your classroom? And finally, evaluate the success of your project. In the real workforce, your boss says, how did that go? You have to evaluate it. Well, your students need to do that as well. And that'll also help you for next year. You can look at their evaluation and say, this is what I might do differently. I thought I'd also give you some examples of projects that teachers have used in their classroom. So here's an example from a high school geometry class. The driving question is, how can we design a school for the future? So that's a good driving question. It's open-ended. It requires a lot of research and multiple activities to do. The students are designing something. They're considering the future. They're considering their community needs. And so the end product is going to be a design plan with scale drawings and models that is presented to school officials and or community experts. So remember, having a public audience, having that goal at the end is also very important. So they're going to have to research current designs of the school and sort of brainstorm, collaborate, and anticipate future needs. Another thing that's really awesome about project-based learning is there are infinite possibilities for cross-curricular collaboration. So keep that in mind as you're building your first project. A second example, really quick, high school biology class, driving question. Why do we perspire? So having the students run around and examine their physiological response to exercise and then design a laboratory investigation to sort of test their hypotheses as to why do we perspire. So you can talk about cellular structure and function, cellular respiration, physiology, anatomy. You can get a lot of content in there, as well as the very important skills of the scientific method, inquiry, collaboration. So these are just two very different examples of how you can use project-based learning in your classroom. So to summarize, really use your online resources and explore that website. That's really the only thing that I really want you to take time to do between now and Wednesday night, so that on Wednesday night we can share what we've learned and we can start to build our own project-based learning approach and have fun with it. If you're not having fun, your students aren't going to have fun. Now I know that that was a really quick introduction and summary of project-based learning. I really flew through all of that, but I just want to give you the most amount of time as possible for you to do your own exploration. And I look forward to seeing all of you on Wednesday.